Hey, Tripp.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So Tripp and I know each other kind of from Paul Vanderklay's channel and Discord server. And we both wanted to start off by saying that we're having a cheers, and that the best way to
Cheers.
discuss theology after we've put our kids to bed is with a little bit of whiskey. So
Especially if we're talking about Aquinas, because he did like love his drinks.
he did
So
love his
for
drinks.
sure.
So maybe
Yes,
maybe to properly understand him, one needs a little bit of lubrication
I think
themselves.
so. I think so.
Do you want to introduce yourself just a little bit, kind of your background and sort of your how you got how a Protestant got interested in Thomas Aquinas?
Yeah. So I grew up in like a fairly conservative small town, in like some really small town, North Carolina. My my address, I always tell people my address growing up was Route 1, Box 227A. So we were like literally there wasn't even a street name, like Route 1. And so it was deep south for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Um but I ended up going to a classical Christian school. The public schools in North Carolina were hot garbage. Um, like 48th in the, I think they were ranked 48th in the country and that kind of stuff. And so like people were finding any way to get their kids out of like those failing schools into
Mm-hmm.
something else. And so I ended up going to a classical Christian school because my parents valued education, even though they neither of them really went um, to college and that kind of thing. And so I ended up going to kind of a classical Christian school, and there was a guy, my English teacher, and who was also my basketball coach and a former Marine, and like he had a philosophy degree and that kind of stuff, and so like he ended up teaching English and logic and that kind of stuff at our classical Christian school. And so he ended up becoming, it was the first time I ever did well in school. I was a terrible student up until that point, because I just didn't care.
Mm-hmm.
I thought this was silly, and I thought like it was like I was being just told to memorize things, and that kind of stuff. And so I just like didn't care at all. And so I was a terrible student until him. And then it like started to make me think, oh wait, there are things about the world that I don't understand, and I want to understand them. And that's actually what education is understanding more about the world, who I am, who God is, who like what is this thing that we're interacting with, and that kind of stuff. And so I ended up going, progressing through like 5 years roughly under this guy's tutelage. I ended up going to Duke, and studied artificial intelligence, and that was kind of my philosophy of mind is my background. And so I
Cool.
got a
I bet
philosophy degree.
Duke is about as proud as you can make some North Carolina parents,
Oh, oh yeah, well, I
unless
mean,
they're Tar Heel fans. But
I was gonna say, like, the most people are Tar Heel fans, and so like this is like people are like, yeah. So it's as impressed as you can be, except then you get these people that like, oh no, my granddad and my dad went to UNC, and Duke's evil, and you should all die, kind of thing. And
mm,
so yeah, so I definitely went with that. My dad, yeah. So anyway, long story short, so I went to Duke. Computer engineering, computer science, and philosophy were my majors, and then I got a master's in philosophy, in philosophy of mind. And so that's what I do actually for Amazon is artificial intelligence and machine learning research. Um, my philosophy degree though, like I specialize in Aristotle and Aquinas essentially in terms of philosophy of mind. And so
mm-hmm.
that's the most research that I ever did regarding that. It was a kind of a crazy last couple years there because I ended up writing my thesis and engaging with Ray Kurzweil as part of my thesis defense. And then I also ended up helping edit Alvin Plantinga's book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, about science
Oh,
and
I read
faith
that
and that
book.
kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
That book was really helpful for me. Yeah.
yes, I was going back and forth with Dr. Plantinga back then,
That's
because
super cool.
he was actually helping me. Like I would send him my thesis and then he would rip it apart because he's way smarter than me, and he's also not very nice.
he,
And
and he doesn't like divine simplicity either.
No, he doesn't. And so, but because like of our relationship and going back and forth, he actually asked me to help edit that book.
Wow.
Um, and because I am more of a classical philosophy like minded person, and so things like he wanted the best, he wanted a good critique of what he was saying because he's an analytic philosopher and he's not a fan of divine simplicity and that kind of stuff. And so like a lot of these things, like he wanted like honest critiques. And so like so I got the opportunity to edit that book. I can't take credit for almost anything in the book, but occasionally I did like critique something and he wrote back and said, and like the most praise I ever got from Dr. Plantinga was, that's not a totally stupid thing to say. And that is like the most Dr. Plantinga thing. You're like, yeah, okay. If you're saying what I'm saying is not totally stupid, I'm good with that because, you know, like he's brilliant. And
Yeah.
but yeah, so that was like one of the highlights of my philosophy career was just hearing him say, what you're saying is not totally stupid.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Like I had something of like a science and faith crisis might be too strong of a word, but you know, something like that in college. And I remember reading his book. When did that come out? Would that have been like 2009 or 10 or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, I graduated in 2007, so we were working on it like my senior year, and then like probably up until the year after that. So that sounds about right.
Yeah, so that's when it would have when I read it, and I still remember that that's where he introduced, or maybe he didn't introduce it, but maybe that was the first book of his that had the evolutionary argument against naturalism, right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. I still
Yeah.
think that's a
No,
really useful one.
it's super useful, and yeah, I mean, no, it was a great book. It ended up really being really good. But yeah, like so I was invited only because he knew he disagreed with me on a lot of things, and he wanted someone to like give him an honest critique from the Christian perspective, as opposed to like a cynical critique that he could get any day of the week from kind of the
or
secular perspective.
or a yes man Christian,
Right. Well,
right?
that's the thing too. And someone with his stature, like he knew that that he could get that all day long. He could either of those, the yes
Right,
man, or he can get the I disagree with you just because,
right.
and I'm gonna like the secular perspective and the naturalistic perspective. And he knew I wasn't gonna do that. Um, and so yeah, so that was one of the highlights. That was one of the things that I will remember till I die, is so those like conference calls with Alvin, and
That's
just
super
like
cool.
going forward. And honestly, like he's just way smarter than me, and so like he just like would rip me apart and all this kind of stuff. So but it was fun. Like it's what I love. So
Mm-hmm. That's a really cool story. I didn't know that because Tripp and I have talked before. One thing that you don't know, Tripp, is that I have a new job. I work for Kroger now, the
Kroger,
grocery,
okay.
yeah, the grocery store conglomerate,
Yeah.
in their sort of tech and analytic subsidiary. And so they're trying to. I honestly can't say too much because now we're like actually really direct competitors.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yes. The Amazon and Kroger are. you and I are working on very different things, I think,
That's
at this point.
probably
But
true.
yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, my Kroger's trying to get into healthcare analytics in its own way.
Oh,
Um, and
interesting.
so I got hired to be part of their kind of. I probably actually honestly can't say much more than that.
Okay. Did you like
And
it?
I'm still pretty new. It's only been a
Okay.
couple months, so I think I'm still getting settled in. But there's a lot of
And do you work
interesting.
remote?
No, they have an office in Chicago. Their
Okay.
headquarters is in Cincinnati, but they have a pretty big tech contingent in downtown Chicago. So,
Okay.
so I
Gotcha.
commute down there now. Yeah.
Okay.
But
Well,
anyway, so now we're previously we were perhaps not competitors, but in very similar industries, and now
yeah.
we're definitely something like direct competitors.
Yeah.
But we also have this side interest of liking to talk about philosophy and theology
And
and all that stuff.
honestly, it's way more interesting.
Yes, it is, and apparently liking to drink a little bit of scotch.
Yes, we like our I'm having bourbon,
Well,
so
fair
that's
enough.
my
If you're from North
yeah.
Carolina, I suppose that's
Of course,
allowed.
only a genteel Southerner would.
All right. So, if you don't mind, could you explain what the doctrine of divine simplicity is? It has simplicity in its
Sure.
name, so it can't be too complicated, right?
Yeah. Well, yes, totally. It's very very simple. Um, so the doctrine of divine simplicity is that God is not composed of parts. That He doesn't have um, parts that are separated from other parts, nor does he have potencies that have not been actualized, nor does he have actual properties that have never been actualized. So, like, he does not change in that sense. Like, he's simple, um, and so that's the most like succinct way I can describe it. I think that the thing that people need to think about when they're thinking about divine simplicity is that it's more of a statement of what God is not than a statement of what God is.
Mm-hmm.
That God is not composed of parts, that God does not have potencies that have been actualized at one point and not actualized at other points and that kind of stuff. So I'm using some Thomistic and Aristotelian language, but um, that's it's more of a statement of God. What God's not is that he's not like this kind of component part the way that you and I are, where it's like, substance accidents, where it's form and matter and that kind of thing. Like he is one being that is pure spirit that acts, pure act in the Aristotelian sense. And so um, there's no like there's no there's no things that God could be that he is not. There's no distinction then between his properties and what God is. And so that's like the bottom level of divine simplicity, which is different from you and me, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you even as part of your essence, you are rational,
Mm-hmm.
right? You have hair and you have all these properties around you and that kind of stuff, and some of them are accidents. So an accident would be something where I could change it but not change what you are. So like your hair could turn silver, like you could
It
have gray
is,
hair.
yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I get, the light's not very good, but yeah, so like, um, so your hair could turn silver, but it doesn't change what you are.
Right.
You are still you. And so the predicate, like, the object and kind of predicate doesn't change in that sense. However, um, you know, with God, it's not like that, where you can't say, well, God is loving, and say, well, but we could change that about God and it would still be God. God has to be loving. God has to be good. God has to be all these things. And so, like, this distinction between the property of God that we ascribe to God is not really different than what God is, in that sense. And so that's like it's hard. I will say that, like, before we get into this, that there's also, like, that goes along with the doctrine of divine simplicity is the doctrine of analogy. And this is a very Catholic thing, and Aquinas was really, really big on it, is that when we talk about God, when we talk about his properties, when we talk about his, like, personhood or any of these things, that we're using analogies to talk about him.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference between what, like, the analogies that we use, the difference between creature and the creator is always greater than like the difference is always greater than the similarity. And so, like, when we use things like personhood or rationality or anything else like that to talk about God, we have to be really humble whenever we approach that, to say, yeah, I mean, we're using these things as analogies to what God is like. However, it's really important to understand that God is way different than any language that we can actually, like, use to describe him. And so there's a certain amount of, like, we just have to, like, we're using this. And so this is why the doctrine of simplicity, before you talk about the Trinity or before you talk about the doctrine of simplicity, you need to approach it with that. I feel like with that kind of bent. Otherwise, you're going to like act like things are univocal, like the language that I'm using is exactly what it's like with God, as opposed to analogical, which is the language that I'm using is like what God is, but I have to be humble and say that this language is completely inadequate and is actually is way more different than the ways that it's similar. So I hope I hope that that's helpful in terms of setting it up.
Sure. So one question that came to mind. So God has always been fully actualizing his potentialities.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well, he doesn't have any potentialities. Like that would be the
okay,
Thomistic perspective. He has no potentialities. Like
just
he's pure.
actualities.
He is just pure act, pure
Gotcha.
act. And this would actually go back to Aristotle too. Is that he's pure act. There is no potentialities, because a potentiality has to be actualized by someone else, not someone else, but like by an external force.
Uh-huh.
No one actualizes themselves. And so, if so, like, this whiskey glass is, is sitting on the table. It's potentially able to be lifted up, and I can drink it. However, it takes something other than the whiskey glass to actualize that happening. And so this is like a key to Aristotelian and Thomistic metaphysics, is that you cannot be actualized by something out, like you cannot actualize yourself. That potentiality is not like self-actualized and that kind of stuff. So God then has no real potentialities that are not fully act all the time.
Okay. So how does this relate to creation? Like, specifically, God is a creator or
Yep.
creative by essence. Um, and then we have creation and we have time, and that would be one of the things probably that Aristotle and Aquinas would disagree about, is eternity. So how could God
Maybe. I
always...
guess let's go back to that. Why would you think that Aristotle and Aquinas would disagree about eternity?
I would thought that Aristotle would have believed in the eternity of the universe, whereas Thomas would have been an ex nihilo creation supporter.
Yeah, I guess I don't know what Aristotle really thought about that. That's a good question.
I'm just presupposing that like almost all of
Yeah,
the Greeks back then thought that, and I'm just imposing or
yeah.
imputing that
I don't
on
know. Like,
Aristotle.
you may be right. Like I don't actually know. I was just wondering why. Um, I guess the thing is that like um, Aquinas would deeply disagree with, actually, interestingly enough, he would deeply disagree with like the Kalam cosmological argument. Um, as kind of like described by William Lane Craig and that kind of stuff. And so like there was no contradiction for Aquinas that um, that eternity, that like the world could have like existed eternally. Like
Mm-hmm.
he did not find this like a problem.
Yeah.
And I'm not actually sure that I agree with him on this, but like it is interesting that he didn't, and Aristotle for sure didn't. But he didn't, and actually I'll say Aquinas for sure didn't because he explicitly said it. Um, what he saw was a vertical
Right.
um, cosmological argument versus a horizontal one.
Right, or
And so
an
like
eternal cosmological argument as opposed to a temporal cosmological,
exactly,
right? Like that,
exactly,
like I talked about this with Bo Branson and a little bit with Luke, that ase causality or like eternal causation as
right.
opposed to sequential or temporal
Right.
causation. Yeah.
Exactly. The sequential, kind of the sequential causality problem did not bother Aquinas at all,
Mm-hmm.
and so that it would be an interesting thing to see like someone like William Lane Craig debate Thomas Aquinas on this particular issue, because I was just like I would just love to listen to it, but like that wasn't a problem for Aquinas. Insofar as, yeah, just like the eternity past, like eternity past, who cares?
Right.
I'm interested in a hierarchical um, view of causation, not a sequential view of causation.
Right. And that's just so different than the way us modern people think. We
Yes.
we can scarcely even imagine what causation means without sequence or whatever. And I don't know if that's David Hume's fault or if that's just
Yes, it is
a symptom.
100% David Hume's fault. I will 100% lay this on the on the feet of David Hume. He is the worst. Yes.
Although he did kind of he did kind of what kind of Bayesian thinking was sort of first in David Hume, even before it was
Well,
formalized in the Bayes formula. He sort of preconceived it in a
yeah,
nascent
I guess
form.
the thing is that, like, actually, I would almost argue that Bayes um, uh, was a reaction to Hume, as opposed to something that he came up with, right?
Interesting.
Because, and so, like, what he talked about, in Esther and I talk about this all the time, is that what happened with Hume is that he, in his book Miracles, basically argued that like there's no rational reason to believe in any miracle because by definition, almost, all miracles are more improbable than not.
Right.
And so like he came up with this whole like probability like kind of argument against miracles.
It is almost a Bayesian kind of argument.
It is a Bayesian argument, except after that, it was actually, one second, like, so like Bayes was, um, it was actually a response to Hume that this argument of Bayesian reasoning came about, was
Interesting.
basically saying, listen, um, what happened was, you're arguing that this event in itself is improbable, and so therefore, um, I'm more rational in believing something else. And what Bayes was trying to argue is like that's not necessarily true, given certain priors, given certain like additional information, a independently improbable event like say the resurrection becomes more probable than not. And so it was actually in response to Hume that Bayesian reasoning came about, not because of Hume. Well, I mean, you can say because of Hume, but not because Hume came up with it, because he didn't. And so, like again, you know, like you can say, well, someone rising from the dead is super improbable, obviously, because like that doesn't happen. However, what if I had a bunch of credible witnesses saying, no, I saw this guy get nailed to the cross and die. And then 3 days later, I saw him walk out of a tomb. And so you add, so like you have your priors of like the resurrection being super improbable. And this is one of the things that Esther and I were trying to allude to with like Adam Friended. Whenever we had that conversation with them, is like, okay, so you have these priors of this being very improbable. However, if you add this other information that these people are giving like pretty credible eyewitness like testimony about what this guy did and where he was and who the names were and where people were and all these kind of things, then they're saying, I don't know what to say, except like 3 days later, the dude came out of the tomb and like talked with us and had dinner with us and spent a month with us and all that kind of things. Like those additional pieces of information changes my Bayesian reasoning.
Right.
And so that's where I would say like Hume is kind of both to credit and to blame for Bayesian reasoning, because I don't think he didn't come up with it. However, his nonsense about like in his book of miracles, like basically like spurred this kind of argument. And I think it's been super helpful, both from like a data science kind of like Bayesian machine learning is like a thing. We use this all the time.
It works.
And so like it totally works. And so like that, but then before even like the machine learning aspects, from a philosophical perspective and a mathematical perspective, no, this totally like it totally makes sense that this like Bayesian reasoning works in terms of like updating our priors and figuring out what the most probable explanation for something is. So like anyway, that's a diatribe from our main thing, but like Hume triggers me. So sorry.
Hume triggered. And I think the last thing that should be said on that topic is like Michael Shermer went on Unbelievable, I think, recently, and he sort of trotted out David Hume's argument against miracles. And it should be pointed out that David Hume's argument against miracles is at best an argument against believing in miracles. It is not an argument that miracles can't happen. Right?
No.
And so many people are like, oh, David Hume disproved miracles. No, he no. At best, if he even succeeded, he said that one should not believe reports of miracles.
Right. That was his argument, and I actually disagree with him there. However, that was his sole argument. It's not an argument that miracles can't exist. Like that was not his point at all. It was just like it was a probability thing, and so and I think he's like I think he's technically wrong there. That it's like saying, I guess I could go back. Like if I gave you. Okay, so let's go back and say I gave you a story of a leader that like raised an army and from a small-ish country just took over the entire Persian Empire and then invaded India too, just for good measure, and won every battle. And just dominated everyone. And then he died mysteriously. If I gave you that story and I asked you, like, and you had no prior knowledge, like, I think you know who I'm like referring to, but if you had no prior knowledge, what is the probability that you would give that story of being completely true, that like this guy like raised an army from a small country, took over the most powerful empire in the world, invaded other places that no one even really knew existed, and then just died at the age of like 25. You would say, well, almost none, right? There's no way that story is actually true.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it sounds pretty far-fetched, but it is true. And like given other priors, like say eyewitness testimony, like other people like writing down what happened, and other reports from the area of what was going on, and the division of the empire after the fact, like all these things play in. The event itself is independently super unlikely, like approaching zero.
Right.
Given other information, it becomes more likely than not. And so that's where Hume made the error, is he didn't say, like, given other information, how do I figure out what is more likely than not? That was where his problem was. But you're absolutely right that like Hume's point was never, this is impossible, this could never happen. That was never his syllogism that he tried to do at all. It's just a like, why would you ever believe this? Which is in some sense a legitimate question.
Right. It was more pragmatic, really, than anything, almost.
For sure. Yeah. No, it's not a stupid question. He was technically wrong.
Yes.
In how you like evaluate what that is, but he's not stupid. Mm-hmm. And so like in that sense, like that's probably the reason that Hume triggers me, is because he's just smart enough to get to a good question, and then I get frustrated that he didn't go farther. So
yeah, and it's like the question, what's the probability that someone could spread their genes to like a quarter of the modern descendants of Asia? Minuscule.
Exactly.
But if you flip around the question, what individual, is there, of the individuals that have contributed genetically to Asia, what percentage do you think the winner of that contest got to? Right? It's sort of like the question, what's the probability of winning the lottery? Minuscule.
Right.
What's the probability that someone won the lottery? 100%, Right.
No, and that's like Tim McGrew makes a really good article about this that you might be interested in, is that it's exactly that, is that like like the probability that you won the lottery is like nothing, basically. However, if you go to the local news and you say, hey, I've won the lottery, I won the Powerball, and that kind of stuff, like the probability goes way up that you're actually telling the truth, that you actually did win the lottery, even though this was an independently really unlikely event. And so like Tim has a really good, we should put this in the comments of the video, but like that's exactly his point, is that like but like given other like testimony, given other evidence, I'm not completely unjustified in thinking that this is the more likely explanation for what just happened.
Right.
And he's exactly right from an epistemological perspective. Like you're exactly right. Yeah.
Right. And, in the same way that you could ask, what's the probability that someone would win the lottery 5 times? Like nothing. But you could do the math of who's probably, of the person who's won the lottery the most times, you can do the math, and how many times do you think that person has won the lottery? And you're like, actually, just do a Poisson distribution, and it's like, okay, well, it's like 5. And of the person who's had the biggest impact on history, who within 300 years got the Roman emperor to worship him without killing a single person or raising a single sword. Okay, so no one denies those historical facts. what is the
Totally.
probability that something very unusual was going on with that person? It's
Well, and
almost
that's
it's almost 100% that something very weird and unique happened.
exactly, and that's where like someone like Douglas Murray would say, like, whenever he's looking at it, it's like, okay, something weird happened, like something strange happened
Mm-hmm.
in Palestine around this, in Judea, like something weird with this person happened. Like, even though Douglas Murray is an atheist and all this kind of stuff, he's like, I don't know, or maybe he would describe himself as an agnostic.
He called himself a
But
Christian atheist, I think, to Esther
right,
recently. Yeah.
yeah. So, like, someone like that would say, like, okay, I don't think that this guy was God, but something weird happened, something. And I was like, yeah, well, that's the most honest approach. If, like, you're not, like, if you're on the atheist bent, is the something weird happened. There's no other explanation for this near, like, 0%
Right.
chance happening. Yeah.
Right. So, okay, that was a fun diversion. Um,
Yeah. Sorry.
no, no,
So
I
back to
enjoyed
divine
that.
simplicity.
Back to simplicity. Okay, so we got David Hume hijacked our conversation by
Yeah.
making us think that all causation has to be temporal or sequential. And it does seem, from what I can think, it seems like this non-temporal form of causation really is essential to understanding the Trinity in almost no matter what way that you conceive of
Mm,
it. And I think that at least part of the reason why perhaps the Trinity doesn't connect as well with people today is some of these things that have seemingly gotten lost or confused in the sands of time. Um, but so Thomas Aquinas would have thought that the universe is not eternal. He would have believed in creation ex nihilo. But for him, there was no problem with conceiving of an eternal universe because he didn't think of God causing the universe in that sort of cosmological like way, like, well, what was happening before the Big Bang sort of thing. That wasn't
right.
his argument.
Yeah.
His argument was that almost like there's this constant emanation from a source, there needs to
Right.
be the source of which there is no source that is,
Right.
giving rise to, being and everything itself.
Right. Yeah. That was his. Yes, that's the cosmological argument according to Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle,
Hmm.
essentially. So it wasn't until, I mean, it was much later that you had, like, the modern form of I call it, I mean, I'm using the, Kalam cosmological argument that was popularized by William Lane Craig. But that's the sequential, the chronological one.
Yeah.
But that wasn't, I think that people often, like, conflate the two, and they're very different kinds of arguments. Like, for Aquinas, there is no problem with us, like, eternally, like, kind of sequential chain of events. That's
Right.
not a problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but
which
it,
which is important, for the Trinity, right?
yes,
If you,
yes,
like, you cannot have an eternally begotten son if
right,
you found that to be a problem.
right,
And
exactly.
so that is why I actually disagree with William Lane Craig here. And I think that Aquinas was right, that if you're going to go with the Trinity and an eternally begotten son, then it can't be the case that the sequential causation is a problem. It can't be.
Right, right, because you need the son being caused by the father, but you need that to be true from eternity past,
Right.
or
Yes.
else things get problematic one way or another. Yeah, and
Well, I mean,
William
the
Lane Craig
Bible's
has a
very.
weird trinity in any case,
I
but
I know he has a weird Trinity. He doesn't like divine simplicity, and William Craig's a very, very smart person. And I like him, but yeah, he's just wrong here. And I think that like you have to have like an eternally begotten son, which like kind of like it like I said, it throws a wrench in the whole like chronological, like, oh, you need this and then this and then this and then this, and then we're like, well, wait, this is eternally begotten? What does that mean? So I think that you have to like the Trinity and divine simplicity. Well, so divine simplicity, I think, is different. The Trinity is something that I think you would only get from revelation. Like, it is not logically derivative of like metaphysics or any kind of philosophical system. Like, you would never actually get there.
The weird thing is I disagree with you on that. This is one of our funny disagreements.
I'm sure you do.
I think it wasn't divinely inspired, but it was backed into in sort of a very strange historical process.
No, I mean, I mean, that would be an interesting. So we can get there, but like, from my perspective, it's not something that I can like syllogistically kind of like argue for in the same way that I can for, say, the basic cosmological argument or divine simplicity, which I think I make it like a much more like logical case for. The Trinity is something that I think that is revelatory.
Yeah,
it is not something that it is and for Aquinas too, that is what it was. It was like, he's like, hey, I'm trying to make sense of this. It's not something that fits easily into the categories that I'm working.
Right.
And so like, and Aquinas was very like honest about that. And so you read the Summa and that kind of stuff. Like, he entertained all those questions about like, is there a distinction between the Father and the Son? And is there a difference between the Father and the Son? And all those kind of things. Like, he entertained those questions because they're hard questions. They're not something that like you can just like easily, but he did think that they were derived from the testimony of the Scripture, and I think I agree with him. But it's not something that I can give you like a philosophical syllogism.
It can't be deduced from other prior principles.
No,
it needs it needs to not be logically inconsistent. It needs to fit in with the other things that we can derive, but it is not one of the things that follows from previous, assumptions or axioms or whatever. Yeah, that I can understand. So I guess the first most obvious question is, I would think that most kind of common everyday Trinitarians would say, well, it certainly sounds like God's made out of parts. It sounds like there's 3 parts. You said that God can't have parts. So what's the answer to that question?
Well, so like when we say parts, we're talking about the divine essence or the substance of God. And so we say like there's no difference between the divine essence or substance between the 3 like persons of God. And so like one of the things that like is both useful and can get a little bit weird when you're first introducing to like Aristotelian or kind of Thomistic metaphysics is like, it's very dependent on language.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so so that gets complicated because we use things like potency and act and all this kind of things, and like things get weird. Fine. However, one of the things that I found that is useful is saying, well, listen, we're talking about the metaphysics that reflect like our language that we use to navigate the world and we talk about the world is actually really reflective of the world, that we don't actually like make shit up. Mm-hmm. in other words, that like there is something real. Like, we can say it's analogous, we can say all those kind of things, but like there is something actually real about the world that we're talking about, and why language develops Like, there's a reason that you can translate English to Chinese.
Right. Right.
Because, like, fundamentally, we're describing the same world.
Right.
And there will be, like, different, like, kind of, you know,
And human nature
there'll
and
be different,
human
like,
linguistic capacity is the same, you know, and
right. Yeah, the human linguistic capacity is the same, and the world we're looking at also is the same. And so, like, there will be, like, little nuances that, like, happen in English versus Chinese or whatever, but, like, more or less, like, we're pretty much, like, speaking the same language, right? Like, we're
yeah.
talking about the same thing, and we're looking
Right.
at it. Okay. So this is, like, one of the fundamental things about Aristotelian or Thomistic metaphysics is, like, okay, given that, is there a difference between a what and a who?
Mm-hmm.
And so with the Trinity, that's a really important question.
Yes.
When we're talking about the essence of God, the what, and the who of God, the person.
Mm-hmm.
And so we would say, like, divine simplicity is about the what.
Okay.
What is the definition of God? What is the essence of God? What is this divine essence that we're talking about, and that kind of thing? The who is a very different question. And so that's where you would say, well, listen, divine simplicity is about the what and not the who.
Mm-hmm.
And so the who, we have three different persons. The divine essence is the what. And so that's where, like, divine simplicity kind of plays in with the Trinity and for Aquinas. And I think, and it makes sense to me, like, yeah, it just makes sense to me that, like, the divine essence is, I can't come up with a syllogism that would suggest that the same essence can't be communicated between different persons. Like, I have no syllogism there. I have no argument that that's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore I have to, like, kind of rely on revelation to suggest
Sure.
that is possible.
And we
And
don't
so I
have a
think that,
mathematical proof that there would be three exactly, as opposed to 2 or
no,
18 or whatever.
no,
That's a revelation
100%.
thing. Yeah.
Were it not, like, this is all about interpretation of our revelation. And so, like, it's, and that's when, like, the early church fathers, like, the Trinity was a big sticking point.
Right.
Like, and, like, the divinity of Christ, and was he a man or was he God? Was he both? Like, these were hard questions that, like, the early church fathers were actually, like, struggling with.
Yeah.
And it makes sense because, like, we're dealing with something that's fundamentally different than us. And so, yeah, so I would say the divine simplicity applies to the what, the Trinity applies to the who. And I think that that's the best way that I have to think about it. But again, I'm
Mm-hmm.
using analogies, and,
Yeah.
like, what is a person? What does a person entail? What does an essence mean for God versus us, and all those kind of things? Like, these are like, these require more conversation, and also language that I don't have.
Sure.
So,
But that distinction between what and who does seem like one of those things at the fundamental bedrock of language. Like, right, like every language, English, Chinese, I actually don't know Chinese, but as far as I know, basically every language has, you know, ways of talking about people, right? You know, it's the difference
right.
between who and it, right?
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of grammatical constructions around, oh, I'm talking about a person. Oh, I'm talking about a thing that's not a person, right? That seems to be
Well,
a distinction that's in all languages.
I would take a step back though. Like, I can talk about your body.
True. True.
Are you a who? I like, there's some things where it's not just a clear it versus who.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or like talking about
And
human nature or something like that.
right. And so, like, it's not like there's some things that are clearly an it only, like a rock. and there's some things that are clearly a who. However, even of the who things, there's also an it there in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
there's a body, like you will be a corpse one day.
Right. Right. And
What is the who versus the it?
okay,
And
I see what
like
you're saying. Yeah.
again, yeah. So but I would take it, like, just to expound on that, like the this is again an analogy, and so this is why I brought this up very, very early, is because, like, obviously God doesn't have a body, right? There's
Right.
no like and those kind of things. So like the temporal aspect, or the temporal um challenges of thinking about God in that way are challenging. However, there is, like, even within our kind of metaphysical framework and the way that we're thinking about these things, there is a difference, though, between a what you are and a who you are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and so if I ask, like, what you are, you would answer, like, if I ask, okay, what are you? And I said, who are you? These are different questions.
Yeah.
And you would answer them differently. And so, like, this is like the core to the Aristotelian and Thomistic framework, is you have to be, the language that we use to ask these questions and answer them is in some way reflective of reality. And so the same is true for God. And so, like, again, they're analogies. So like if like the complaint is like, you guys aren't giving me like a precise way of thinking about the Trinity or divine simplicity and that kind of stuff, guilty as charged.
Mm-hmm.
You're completely right. And in fact, as Augustine would say, if I could give you definitions, what I'm defining is not actually God. And so, like, guilty as charged. That's fine. What I'm saying is that, like, we're using these terms to describe these things, and we're using this language because in some sense we're giving you an analogy to what God is like. And so I think that's the, like, scholastic argument, like the classical Christian argument. Like, it's not the caricatured, like, American evangelical
Right.
version of what the Trinity is. But I think that is what Augustine and Aquinas saw it as, is like, listen, man, we're giving language and we're ascribing terms and that kind of stuff, and we get it. It sucks. Doesn't really work. However, this is as best as we can do. And it seems to be kind of supported by the scriptures. So, like, let's go with that and let's work our metaphysics and our philosophy around it, as opposed to trying to come up with it and argue with it. I argue for it a priori. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the best I can do. Yeah.
Sure. I appreciate that. So I guess let's see here. Here's where I might start interrogating you.
Yeah.
To see if this holds together at least. So the what of God. So this nature, right? The divine nature, which is the indivisible, simple thing. Is that like the same sort of thing as like when we talk about you're a human, I'm a human, we have human nature, right? Is it like category, right, would be almost like the way that like a modern normal English speaker would use? Or are we talking about something a little bit more united than just like a the same, us being in the same category when we talk about, like,
Yeah.
say,
I
the
mean,
Father, Son, and Holy
yeah.
Spirit?
Right. And again, this is where, like, this is where the doctrine of analogy is really, really important. Um, that what we're saying, yeah, you're, like, we're not talking about God's essence as being like a genus.
Right.
Again, I'm going back to Aristotle.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a genus, and then you have, like, the species of God the Father, God the Son, the
Right.
Holy Spirit.
So it's not
Um,
like table, and then here's a table, there's a table, there's a table, there's a table. They're all tables. The genus is
Oh,
table.
right.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So you're not doing that. Like you're saying, and this is like again goes back to scripture. Like Jesus being in very nature God did not consider God something to be like equality with God something to be grasped. So what you're saying is like, okay, if Jesus is in very nature God, which is a very interesting turn of phrase because actually nature is more encompassing than essence in the Greek.
Well, I would disagree with the interpretation of the Greek morphe, but I'll let you keep going for now.
Okay, so
I'll give you a slide for now.
Okay. We if we want to have a separate conversation and we can just go into the Greek, let's do that because that
Sure.
would be fun. But yeah, so like the argument would be, at least let me lay out the argument. I don't. And so like and so Jesus being in very nature God. So in very nature is not the same thing as essence in the Greek. In very essence God. It's more encompassing than that, actually. And it's not lesser than. It's not just like Jesus being borrowing from the properties of God or anything else like that. Like Jesus being very nature God was more encompassing than the essence, actually. So like the best analogy that I can come up with is if I said like the essence of a triangle is it's a three-sided figure, right, with straight sides. Okay, that's the essence of a triangle. The nature of a triangle actually encompasses more things than that, right? So, for instance, the area being 1/2 the base times the height is part of the nature of a triangle, but it's not part of the essence of the triangle. The essence of the triangle is three like connected straight sides.
The essence is something like the minimum required characteristics to be part of the category, and the nature is everything that precedes and follows from that essence.
Correct. And so like when I read that, like Jesus being in very nature God, it is more than just like, oh, he participated in God or whatever. He actually is in very nature God, like both the essence and all the things that proceed from it. And he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. That was the next sentence. And so you see like a differentiation. So like actually what's interesting is that Aquinas literally calls this a differentiation without a difference, which is like kind of one of the things that we use to like criticize other people. You're making a distinction without a difference.
Yeah, that's an insult.
Yes. And yes, exactly. But like Aquinas kind of used it enthusiastically, be like, yes, this is a distinction without a difference. And so what we saw with Jesus is the same nature, but without a difference between God the Father. Like he did not see equality with God something to grasp. So there's a distinction there. What's really the difference between God the Son and God the Father? That is something that we struggle with, and that's why it's hard to talk about this. Is like really where are we, like metaphysically, where are we drawing the boundaries and that kind of stuff? And like Augustine again said this is like, hey, when you approach the topic of the Trinity, be humble.
Yep.
Right? Don't like.
He says that pretty much right off the bat.
Totally, and that makes and he's completely right. Like if anyone acts like we can come about the Trinity and we can explain it like thoroughly and we can here's how this works and that kind of stuff, you're like, no, you're not actually just explaining the Trinity. So, like, I don't want to discourage you in the sense that, like, I think these are good questions. These are
Mm-hmm.
all like really good questions. Um, at the same time, like, I don't think that there are logical contradictions. They're like, in the Catholic or more the Orthodox, which is probably why Luke wants to like join in this, like, and like these are mysteries
Right.
To our faith of how this actually works and what is this actually like, this kind of triumvirate God look like, and this, like, and Aquinas would say, like, this beatific vision, what does this look like whenever I actually see it? But yeah, I think that that's the kind of the short version of what it would look like. It's the who versus the what, and we need to make this distinction. Um, and then beyond that, there's the fact that we would never have known this were it not for revelation, assuming that we have the same interpretation of what these verses mean, and maybe
Right.
you and I don't. But like, I'll fully admit that like this would never derive from natural theology or anything else like that. Like, I would never be
Right.
able to put together
Right.
this.
And I'm not saying I don't, when I say that I don't totally believe that it's revealed, I at least understand the point. Like basically, Christians were put in a little bit of a conundrum, right? We came from Judaism, and Judaism was very monotheistic. And then we have this Jesus person who we're seemingly worshiping and is super extra connected to God in some sense. And then there's this Holy Spirit, which is even harder to deal with and more confusing. And so in that way, I can totally understand that we Christians have been put in a little bit of a conundrum in terms of trying to figure out what's going on here. And while I think that, in my opinion, the Trinity is not itself the source of divine revelation and more like a human construction, but it is a human construction at the least to attempt to solve this riddle that is
Well,
itself the result of revelation, would be
fair
the
enough.
way I would put
I
it.
think that's, I mean, I guess, no, I mean, fair enough. I think that, like, you're not, I think you're not far off from where a lot of Christians landed and be like, listen, the Trinity is where, like, this is the best description we got, of what actually happened. Um, I do think that there are some, like, passages of scripture, like Jesus being in the very nature God, or whenever Jesus says, for instance, like, before the beginning of time, I am. And then, there are other ones like, um, nothing was created but by him, and those kind of things. And so you get into some things where you're like, okay, this does seem to be kind of equating Jesus with some version of God, or like a demiurge, or whatever you want to call it, whatever name you want to call it. But it does seem to be like kind of an early interpretation of who Jesus claimed that he was. Um, and so I think that, for me, it's the most reasonable explanation of what happened, because otherwise, I don't understand why the Jews wanted to kill him.
Mm-hmm.
To be honest, like they wanted a Messiah. They wanted someone to overthrow the Romans. They wanted all this kind of stuff. Like, and there were plenty of guys that like wanted, like, claimed to do that and tried and failed. And there were plenty of guys that didn't claim to want to do that and were Pharisees and, just kind of lived on their lives. But like, why Jesus
Right.
specifically?
Right.
And like, the most simple explanation is that actually the Gospels are right and Jesus claimed to be God.
That's interesting.
So
I haven't heard that particular argument before. There is one time, and I think it would be specifically in John 10, where it does seem like the Jews understand Jesus to be saying, Jesus says, I and the Father are one. And that's, say, John, I don't know, 20 something or 30
yeah,
something. And then it says the Jews picked up stones to stone him, which is about
right,
like the 12th time in that book where that happens. And then he says, "What are you doing? What good thing? What good work have I done that you're stoning me?" And they say, "We're not stoning you for any of the good works. We're going to stone you because you, being a man, made yourself to be God," I think is what it says. And then
yeah,
Jesus answers. He says, "Wait a second. So back in the Old Testament, there are times where the judges are called gods. You are gods, right?" He quotes the Old Testament, and then he says something like, "And scripture can't be broken." If it's okay to call people who the word of the Lord came gods, why is it wrong that I am telling you that I am the Son of God? Which he's pointing out, he said, I and the Father are one, right? So
right,
he's pointing out that he's calling God his Father, not that he's saying that he is God. And then they get mad at him and try and stone him again. And I feel like in that particular passage, and it's John 10 to 30-ish or something like that, Jesus has that accusation leveled at him that he's specifically making himself out to be God. And he
right,
seemingly denies it. He doesn't straight up say, "Whoa, I'm not God," but he takes the tact of saying, "No, it's okay for humans to be called gods in some certain circumstances, but I'm not even doing that, people. I'm just calling myself the Son of God. So if it's okay to call people gods sometimes, then it must certainly be okay for some people to be called the Son of God. So don't stone me. Calm down. Stop."
right. I mean, no, yeah, no. I mean, you're right. I think you have to take these things and like they're kind of like in like a totality. Sorry, I'm gonna switch back to my other
Sure.
earpiece because they're all dying. And but like so in John 8, for instance, Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham."
I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you. I don't know if your new ear pod connected or
Oh,
something like that.
okay. Can
Oh,
you hear
there
me
you
now?
are. Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Cool. Okay. Sorry.
Sure,
Um,
sure. So
and so like
John,
in John 8,
go
yeah.
ahead.
So in
Yeah,
John 8, he says like, yeah, before the beginning of
before Abraham was.
before Abraham was, I am.
Right.
And that I am is like a Yahweh statement. Like
So
that is a
this is where I will also push back a little bit on that interpretation. So John 8, and I think it's John 8:58 or something, where Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am," and often a Bible will capitalize that. So the phrase "I am" is actually "I am he." And that phrase is used multiple times in the New Testament, mostly in the Gospel of John. Like when Jesus is approaching the boat when he's walking on water, and the
right.
disciples are confused, they're like, "Ah, what's that? It's a ghost, whatever." And Jesus says, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, it's me." He says, "I am." When the blind man that Jesus healed, when the Pharisees are like, where's the blind man who got healed by Jesus? Or could you stand up? Who's the blind man that got healed by Jesus? He
No,
says,
no,
"I am." He says that same Greek
no, no,
phrase.
no, no. No, I get it. I guess no, I see
So
what you're
I don't
saying.
think it's what I'm saying is it's not the divine name to say, "I am he."
I think my hunch is that that's not correct, and the reason that I think that that's not correct is that the reaction that's recorded of the people around him.
Sure. Well, like I said, there's lots of
Like
reasons why they
he
try
could
and
say I am
stone
he. He could
Jesus.
say I'm he. Like well, he says like I am he, and then they pick
Right.
up
I
stones
I
to
think
like
that
kill him.
they pick up stones to stone him because he was claiming to be more important than Abraham. So like to just give a little bit of the
Well,
context of that,
but who would be more important than Abraham?
the Messiah. So the context.
But that wasn't. But here's the thing. That's the problem. Is that there was many people that claimed to be the Messiah.
Right. Well, I
That
think
was not.
there are
That was
specific
not in
times in
itself.
John where he does get attempted to be stoned just for claiming to be the Messiah. And
Just for claiming.
there's even a passage where it says, this might not be in John, this might be in one of the other gospels. So Jesus asked the Pharisees, was John the Baptist's baptism from heaven or from men? Right? They ask him some question, I'm forgetting what it is, and he
Right.
responds back with
Yeah.
this riddle, was John the Baptist's baptism from heaven or from men? And then the Pharisees like collect amongst themselves, and we get told what they're saying to each other, like, well, if we say it's from heaven, then Jesus will say that he's doing his works from heaven. But if we say that it's from men, then everyone will stone us because everyone thinks that John the Baptist was a prophet, right? So even the Pharisees are scared of getting stoned by people, even for just saying that John the Baptist is not a prophet, right? So Jerusalem seems quick to stone people is something that I would point out.
I know. I mean, it's a good point, but they drugged Jesus before the Romans to be crucified,
right?
Not because he claimed to be the Messiah.
I think. Well, what did it say on the plaque above his head? It said the King of the Jews, right?
That was for mocking.
Right.
Not
right.
because that was
I think
that's the difference, though.
Okay, I think that there was Jewish motivations for crucifying Jesus and Roman motivations. I think the Jewish motivations came first, and I think the Romans, they convinced the Romans, like, hey, he's claiming to be Messiah, and like the last 10 of those guys you killed, so could you kill this one too? Because that's rebellion and sedition. Right,
Yeah,
claiming to be Messiah is like claiming to be a revolutionary figure.
Yeah, I guess I read it differently because I don't see anything in the Gospels or any extra biblical sources that tells me that the Romans cared at all about this particular person.
I think they were happy to kill anyone who claimed to be the Messiah.
I think,
right?
I think
oh, wait a minute, you think you're king of the Jews? There are no king of the Jews. Caesar's king of the Jews.
Yeah, well,
get that in your heads, Jewish people.
Honestly, like the Gospels, like seem to me, which I find pretty reliable sources because they tell us a lot of stuff.
I agree.
Don't really seem to line up with like what you would try to do if you were doing propaganda. I actually think that what happened was the Romans did not care all that much.
I think that's probably true.
And they're just like, okay, like if we don't do this, these people are going to cause a problem.
Right.
And so like, I think that like that like picture of Pilate just being like, you know what?
Yeah.
I'm washing my hands. You do it. I don't care.
I think that's probably true.
To go and do it.
But I think I think that Pilate maybe did it to like appease the Jewish elders, right, or something like that.
I think that's 100% what he did. It was just like, okay, I don't want these problems, so you guys go and do whatever.
He doesn't seem like a problem to me, but if you guys say he's a problem to you, you need my permission. You have my permission, right?
Totally. Yeah. And so then the question is like from the Jewish perspective, what was the problem?
Correct.
And like from my I think there were like no shortage of Jewish leaders who were claiming to be the Messiah or a prophet or whatever that were not killed by the Jews.
Right.
There were no shortage of them. They were all fine. And they just did their thing, and they ended up dying because they went up against the Romans, and the Romans like killed them all. What I think the problem for the Jews was that Jesus was actually claiming to be God, and and beyond that, a political God, and that was a problem. That you claiming to be God, like you like they had a picture of a political Messiah that was going to come and overthrow the Roman Empire and do all those kind of things. And Jesus comes and be like, no, I'm God. I'm here for you to save you from your sins. And I don't really care about the Roman Empire. And I think that that was completely an anathema to them, that they just couldn't abide that message. And so that's my reading of it. And so like I would be happy. Like have you taken I'm sure you have like studied Greek.
I am a self-taught beginner when it comes to Greek.
Yeah, I was saying, like, I can tell that you have. And so like it would be interesting for us to go through like the Greek and how these things are described and that kind of stuff, because like in seminary, when like we went through these things.
Have you gone to seminary too?
I have, yes.
When did you do that?
Right after I graduated, yeah. I went to Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte.
In between undergrad and your master's degree?
Yeah, well, no, so I had a very interesting like master's degree program where it was a 4.5-year master's and bachelor's combined with my engineering
that's
degree.
Right. You told me that last time.
Yeah. So like I graduated in 2007 with my master's in philosophy from Duke and my bachelor's of science and engineering from Duke. And then I went to Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte for a while. And so that's where but I also went to like a classical Christian school. So like Greek, Latin, and Hebrew was taught instead of Spanish or French or whatever. And so it was, so like I've taken a good amount of Greek. I'm not like fluent or anything else like that, but I do think it's interesting in reading the way that like John's gospel, for instance, like describes these things. He's describing them way more forcefully than you normally would if you weren't trying to emphasize kind of the divinity of God. And at least that's the way that I read him.
Well, I'll say that John believes
in
the divinity of God. I'm not sure exactly how he incorporates
the divinity
Jesus
of Jesus.
into that.
I think
know
that,
what
like,
you meant.
he's using, he believes in the divinity of Jesus, like, and the way that he's describing it and the words that he's using would be very strange if you weren't trying to actually communicate that.
Right.
And so like I'm not going to give you a syllogism and say like it's impossible. Sure. However, I am saying it'd be very weird if he used these words like logos and those kind of things, because it's, especially in the time and like I think people often underestimate how Greek Judea was whenever these things happen, and how Hellenized that part of the world had been post Alexander the Great, that whenever we read them, we think of them as being like, oh, these are just Jews and they're speaking Hebrew or something like that. And you're like, actually, that's not at all what was going on. Like they were speaking Aramaic and Greek, and like John, clearly Greek was not his first language,
right?
But he was writing in Greek, and Paul is preaching to all these other people.
Sure.
And writing.
Do you think that John had linguistic help, right, with writing John, like maybe a scribe or someone like that?
Maybe. I mean, I think the other thing that I think that's very possible because it is very basic Greek. However, I wonder whether or not Greek was just like a second language that he picked up later in life.
Yeah.
Also, because like he ended his life in Ephesus.
Right.
And so like I don't know if you've been to Ephesus, but
I've been
if you've been there, it's like it's very Greek. Like
Right.
even like the ruins, like the archways, the architecture, the everything was very, very Greek. And so like you had Roman type stuff, but it was like very Hellenized.
Mm-hmm.
And so my he may have had a scribe, or maybe probably had a scribe. What I suspect, though, was either way, John picked up Greek later in his life as a second language.
Right.
And so while he was influenced by the ideas of the Greeks, he wasn't necessarily like, he couldn't write a tome that is beautiful and eloquent. Like, he's not writing Shakespearean English in the Greek
Right. Right.
either. And so, like, that's what I think probably happened with John.
Yeah.
Um,
And the
and maybe he had a
Gospel of
scribe.
John also has the most things in it that seem to suggest that he's speaking to an audience that doesn't know Jewish culture and Jewish ideas natively, right?
For sure.
Like he's
Yes,
like,
which
oh,
makes sense
rabbi. Oh,
because
by the way, rabbi means teacher. Oh, by the way, the
right,
Samaritans and the Jews didn't like each other. Oh, by the way,
totally.
this word means that, right. Like he's
Yeah,
clearly writing to an audience where he can't assume that they know as much as seemingly
right,
Matthew, Mark, Luke,
exactly.
and John
Which
are.
makes sense if he's writing this later in life in
I agree.
Ephesus.
Yes, I think that's true.
And I think that like I think that he's, and so like whether or not he has a scribe, I don't know is as relevant,
Right.
because either way, if Greek was a second language to him, which it seems like at
Right. I
best it
mean, he was a
was,
fisherman from Galilee, right? So
right,
he
like
spoke Aramaic, and then he was maybe younger than Jesus by like 10 years or something. So he was maybe almost like a teenager, right? When Jesus was doing
right,
his ministry.
exactly.
And
And so
then
like
he's in Jerusalem for a while because he's with Peter and James, and then sometime later, probably around the destruction of the temple, he flees to go to Ephesus, and then he's a missionary there till he dies or something like that.
right, I mean, he is exiled and all that kind of stuff, and yeah, so he ends up in Ephesus
Oh,
with
right, and on
Mary, and
the and on the Isle of
yeah,
Patmos for a reason. Yeah.
yeah, he has his own Isle of Patmos, and so he has all this shit happen to him. But like, it makes sense that like, okay, like I can read, and this is where it makes sense to me, because I can read Greek and Hebrew okay.
Yeah.
However, if you asked me to write a story
Mm-hmm.
in Greek or Hebrew, it would come across as super basic,
Right.
right? Because I just don't have the flair. I don't have like all the word, like I don't have all of that you would normally have.
Right.
And so it makes sense to me that like John, as like someone who's not a native Greek speaker, would, even though he's taking some of these ideas like the logos from Greek philosophy and those kind of things, and he's like kind of absorbing them and that kind of stuff, like even if you really like understood it and really could imbibe it, it would be really hard for me it would be really hard for me to write um, a book in French
Right.
about like French philosophy or something like that,
Or
even
even
though like
trying to
I
write a gospel in French.
right, it totally, like it would be really, really, really hard for me to do it with the same kind of flair. I feel like it would come across as like
Flat.
elementary,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like just kind of like a child is writing this or
Yeah.
something like that, even though it's not necessarily what's going on. And so like we have to have some like care in like doing these things, but like it does seem like even still John's gospel, it does seem to me that like he's choosing words that are like specifically talking about divinity with respect to Jesus in ways that even the other gospels don't, which
Right. Well,
is weird.
so kind of on that subject, right? Like Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to be almost devoid of metaphysical speculation about who Jesus is, right? Like they have them ask the question, who do you say that I am, right? And then the correct answer Peter gives is, you're the Messiah, the Son of God, right? And there's seemingly almost no real divinity to Jesus or at least not explicitly stated, right? He can do miracles and all that stuff, but there's no Trinitarians ever give me proof texts from Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Sure.
Um, and then
Those are not the best ones. Yeah.
right. And they're just very biographical. They sound very similar to each other, right? A lot of their quotations overlap and stories overlap, and they just seemingly have like a shared vocabulary. And then the Gospel of John is like, what in the world, right? It's almost strange how different Jesus sounds and the character of the Gospel in John. And what I think is going on is like the first three Gospels were written by native Hellenized Jews explaining this to other Hellenized Jews. And then John is writing probably 10 to 20 years after most of them.
Yeah.
And he, I think, is in a much more Gentile context. And that I think that what's unique about the Gospel of John is that it is kind of written to Jews and Gentiles simultaneously. And he is fighting some theological battles, right? Like the
No,
first
he's
three
definitely doing
Gospels
that.
are just like, kind of, here's the story, here's what happens, here's a bunch of Old Testament prophecies, here's how Jesus fulfilled Old Testament prophecies. It's very Jewish. And I think John is fighting multiple ideological battles at once, right? There's these Gnostics, there's people who think that John the
Right.
Baptist is the Messiah, there's all these weird pagan ideas and Neoplatonism or Middle Platonism and stuff. He's like, all right, I need to communicate to all these people. I need to put out a bunch of theological fires, and I need to do this all in one book. And Greek is my second language, for heaven's sakes.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're 100% right that the time frame in which John wrote this like definitely influences what the message was and what examples were used and what language was used. So I think you're spot on there. I think that's what we call it, the synoptic gospels, and then the Gospel of John, right? It's like the synoptic gospels are just like, they're just trying to record more or less like what happened,
right? And put
like
a theological prophetic spin on it, but
and so
they're not.
Exactly.
Right, but they're not trying.
But John is trying to give a message,
right,
by way of telling that story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that he's making stuff up. He's not.
Right.
And he's not making stuff up. Actually, in a weird way, John is the most precise gospel that we have. Because like there are a bunch of like areas of John. Like, for instance, John records the number of John the Baptist disciples as being 2 that left to follow Jesus. Why 2? Like, why even record the number of that? And he does that all the time in John's gospel. So John the evangelist has an eye for precision that is weirdly kind of, well, it's not weirdly, but it's like it's absent from the other ones. So like some people like, okay, John's so different, it's not reliable. No, that's not. That is not at all what I'm saying. However, John's purpose for writing his gospel is different,
and his context is very different. And
yes,
and I think that the other gospels weren't written with competitive ideas in mind, right? They're just like Christianity 101. And the weird thing about the Gospel of John is it's not Christianity 101 anymore. It's sort of like Christianity's been around in Ephesus, right? Like Paul started the church, or like maybe 40 years before he's writing the gospel.
Yeah.
So this isn't introductory,
for sure.
Yeah, and so it's combative in a way. It's fighting other ideas, and specifically, right, again, neither of us are saying that the Gospel of John is more fabricated than the others, but it has a much more multifaceted purpose in what it's and how it's communicating the Jesus story.
Right. And not only would I say that John is not more fabricated, I would say it's my favorite gospel. It's
Well,
the
I
one that
think
I like.
I will say that I like it better than the
Yeah,
other
it
ones.
is my favorite. It is the most like nuanced, like rich kind of one.
Hmm.
But I completely agree with you that in order to interpret it correctly, we have to contextualize it.
Right.
Like,
Yes.
what is it that like John is trying to argue against, and
Yeah.
what is it that he is arguing for? And maybe you and I would land on different like places about what exactly these things
Hmm.
mean. But I think you're absolutely right that that is the most important thing. Is let's place it within the context that it's meant to be placed,
Hmm.
and then we can properly exegete out of
Right.
that,
Right. Right.
and not like just like make up stuff as if it's the same as the Gospel of Matthew, which is not. It's not.
Right.
It's very different than Matthew,
Hmm.
um, and that's not to say that like one is better than the other or like one is more honest than the other. I don't believe that that's true. I think that they're written for different purposes, though.
Right. I think like at least part of that, you'll notice that in the Gospel of John, he almost seems to have something out for John the Baptist, right? I think that a competitive religion to Christianity at the time was people who were going around teaching that John the Baptist was actually the Messiah. And
No,
that
I
there
mean,
was a group, right? Because he specifically has John the Baptist say, I am not the Messiah. He said it and he didn't deny it, right?
not just that.
Yeah.
Like, he says that he's not Elijah
Right, right, which is confusing because the other gospels say that he kind of is in some way.
because in Matthew Jesus says he is he is
Right,
Elijah, right? You know,
right,
he is like real and whatever. And so like we have to like contextualize all this. I think you're right that like John is kind of like he is in some ways reacting to like the common things and some of the Gnostic heresies,
yes,
right?
yes,
That like that God didn't come here, that like
right.
he
No
wasn't
one
really
has
a
gone
man,
into heaven at any time. Well,
right?
who is
Yes,
asking that, Jesus? Like
right,
what okay, so what? Gnostics thought that they could ascend into heaven with their mind, right? And that
right,
these Gnostic teachers had been to heaven and were teaching people their knowledge from heaven. And so Jesus
right,
says, no one has been to heaven at any time. Right?
right,
And John
exactly,
will also say that Jesus is the only begotten son, right?
right,
Because there are other people who are teaching weird religions where there's all these other sons of God, and Jesus is the only begotten son in
right,
John. He's not
exactly.
the only begotten son in the other, right?
No, and in that way, John's gospel is reactionary. I think it's
Yeah,
also super reliable because I think that there's like weird things in it that you could not make up if you weren't actually there.
right, right.
Um, but yeah, no, you're right. Like John is reacting
Hmm.
one
And
hundred
what
percent
and one
to
of the things, and this is probably most relevant to the Christological stuff, is he's reacting to Jewish resistance to Christianity, right?
mm,
The first couple gospels are really just like, oh, hey, Jews, you might not have heard of this Jesus guy. Let's tell you all the stories. Okay,
right,
you see, Old Testament prophecy fulfillment, Old Testament prophecy fulfillment. Look,
yeah,
Jesus is the Messiah, right? But it's kind of like they're starting with a blank slate, is kind of the way it feels.
right,
In
yeah,
John, it's no longer a blank slate, right? Like we already talked about.
no,
And John is dealing with Jewish resistance to growing Christianity in a way that the other books aren't. And so that's,
right,
I think, part of the reason why in the Gospel of John, the Jews always seem silly, right? They're always misinterpreting or misunderstanding Jesus, and they're always getting mad at him. And they're almost like a foil, right? Or like a dummy
right,
example that you're not supposed to agree with. And I think
right,
that is important for understanding the Jews' reactions to Jesus, is that John is showing that they misunderstood him a lot of the times,
yeah.
right? Like, destroy this
No, I
temple,
mean,
I'll raise it again in 3 days. It took us however many years to build this temple, and you're going to rebuild it again?
right,
And he's making the Jews look stupid, right? He's like,
right,
Jesus, they didn't understand him. He kept saying things,
right,
and then they would take him too literally, right? That's a
right.
recurring theme.
Yeah, that is a recurring thing, and it makes total sense, right?
Right.
That like that that's how silly we must look to God,
Fair enough.
right? That and even like, we, not to get too political. I don't know what your like kind of like political events, but like
Well, I'm
in this
getting near
whole
the
idea
bottom
of
of
like,
my whiskey glass, so keep going.
oh yeah, okay, yeah, I just refilled. So, but like, not to get too political, but it's like the take Trump literally but not seriously, or take Trump seriously but not literally, and that kind of
Right.
stuff. It just seems like, depending on how you take those statements, it can seem so silly.
Right.
Like, what are we, like, really? Like, are we supposed to take this at face value and that kind of stuff? And like, either we should be taking it seriously, in which case the speaker is silly, or I shouldn't be taking it seriously. I should be taking it like metaphorically, and I'm silly for like
Right.
insisting on this.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, that's where like, it makes total sense that John would just point them to these people and be like, they're being silly. Like
Right.
they're asking for something, that they're looking for literal
Right.
when they should be looking for eternal.
Okay. So
And
John 8. So the
yeah.
context is like, and another thing that happens throughout the book of John is John like systematically goes through important either symbols or people in Jewish history and shows that Jesus is more important than the symbol, right? Like Jesus is more
Mhm.
important than the temple. Jesus is more
Right.
important than Jacob, who built the well. Jesus is more important than the manna in heaven that came down from heaven in Egypt, because he's the bread of life, right? Et
Right.
cetera, going through all these symbols. Okay, so what's one of the most important symbols in Judaism? Well, Father Abraham, right? So the Jews are like, we're children of Abraham, we're children of God, right? We're in right standing with God because of our heritage through Abraham. And Jesus is like, no, you aren't. You're actually children of Satan because you don't do the things that Abraham told you to do. And I'm the son, and if you guys are slaves, but if you want to be set free, well, the son who's a true member of the household can set you free. And they're like,
Right.
well, blah, 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 blah. Are you saying that you're more important than Abraham, right? Which is, the Samaritan woman asked him, are you saying you're more important than Jacob? And then, are you more important
Right.
than, the well, right? So Jesus says, Abraham looked forward to my day. He saw my day and was glad, right? And the Jews are like, Abraham lived however many generations ago. Are you saying that you're 1,000 years old, right? That's a paraphrase, but right, that's an example of
Yeah.
the Jews taking what he's saying literally and looking stupid. And Jesus says, assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am he. And what I think he's saying is, I am the one that Abraham looked forward to. I am the Messiah whose day Abraham saw and was glad, right?
Mhm.
And Jesus, like at least 4 or 5 other times in the Gospel of John, identifies himself as the Messiah by saying, I am he. So what I think is going on is that Jesus is saying he's more important than Abraham, right? Because John's having Jesus say that he's more important than all the Jewish symbols. Abraham's one of the Jewish symbols. He's more important than Abraham because even Abraham looked forward to the Messiah. Even Abraham was more excited about the Messiah than he was about himself. And Jesus, here he is, I am he, I am who, I'm the Messiah that Abraham looked forward to. I think it makes perfect sense in context, and it's not Jesus invoking the divine name or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I hear what you're saying. I guess, and maybe we can end it here. Is
Fair enough.
the 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 thing that I would the question that I would have is that, if it was universally accepted that eventually, like, Abraham would look forward to the Messiah, which
Mm,
he did, right? Like, that was prophesied and that kind of stuff. And that was just the expectation from the Jews, is that like eventually there would be a Messiah, and that Messiah could say, Abraham would look forward to me. Why then the capital punishment?
right. I hear what you're saying. So, I mean, here's what I would say about the capital punishment. One, they could have misunderstood him because they clearly do misunderstand him. two, I think that the Pharisees didn't like him because he constantly pointed out how hypocritical they were. And he constantly criticized him, and he was popular for doing so. Right. So I think that, and he didn't follow the Sabbath the way they liked, and a whole bunch of things. And not following the Sabbath the way they liked was a capital offense. Right. And so things like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, but like they didn't kill everyone that didn't follow the Sabbath. John the Baptist also criticized the Pharisees.
Well, how
But
did he end? But he didn't
well,
get
but not by
crucified
then.
in Jerusalem, right?
Not by then.
He got
Not
killed by
not
at
by then. He
request
did.
of Herod's
Yes,
stepdaughter or
because
whoever.
he
Yeah.
criticized a royal marriage,
Yes.
and that didn't go well for him. And so like they and John the Baptist was like the first kind of like rock star pastor.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like he was
Mm-hmm.
like the first kind of like big deal, where like this guy, like mega church pastor, that was John the Baptist. And so
Right.
he was a big deal, a really big deal, like in as much as like, as you're saying, John was probably pretty like tired of people still talking about John the Baptist decades later,
Right.
as if he was like something bigger than he was. And so but the Pharisees didn't have him crucified. They
Although it
didn't do
seems
that.
like they might have wanted to, but there was too much popular support, right?
Well, but
Like
that's the thing. And so,
the
like, was there less
authorities weren't
support?
omnipotent, right? They didn't have total
No, they
control over the
weren't. Like,
people.
and that's yes. Like these are all like kind
Yeah.
of like a spaghetti plate of like power
Yes.
and influence and all that kind
And
of
then
stuff.
there's the
That's true.
Sanhedrin and the Sadducees, and they had their own reasons for disliking Jesus.
Yeah.
Like Paul Vanderklay says, Jesus seemed to be one thing he had in common. One thing that he could unite all the Jewish factions around was that a lot of their leaders didn't like him. And I think
Yeah.
that,
No. Everyone hated him.
and I don't think it was just because he was going around invoking the divine name all the time or something like that. I
No,
think,
for sure. I think that's for sure true. That like that is not the only reason that everyone was pissed off. Like he was sitting with tax collectors, which they hated,
yes,
and like prostitutes and all this kind of stuff. And he was calling them names, and he
mm-hmm.
was like, like he was undermining their authority and all this kind of stuff. Like he was doing all of that, 100%. John was doing a lot of that too.
Yeah.
And yet, there does not seem to be, and this is where I land, is that there, like John, and there were other, like, previous Jewish so called messiahs that had popped up throughout history
Right.
that had claimed certain things, and they're claiming certain power for their own that would take it away from the current Jewish rabbis and all this kind of stuff. And so, you have this was like a common thing, and claiming to be the Messiah, claiming to be the one that Abraham was looking forward to, was not in itself a capital punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And so like what I come back to with Jesus is like, well, like, yeah, he was being annoying, like, yeah, he was being antagonistic,
And he
so
was
was John.
a power threat to the powers that be in terms of
Right,
his
and in the
popularity
same
and
way,
stuff. Yeah.
that John was.
Right.
Like
Right.
John was the same way. And yet they didn't insist that John get killed. Even though John, like decades later, John the evangelist still had to write a gospel to kind of like downplay the like
Yeah.
who John
He said
was.
Jesus was the Messiah. He didn't say he
Yeah,
was, right. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Like, he like denied all this. He confessed and did not deny and all this
Right.
kind of
Right.
things.
Right.
And so
Right.
like that's how popular John the Baptist was, that John the Evangelist was like, guys, calm down with this
In
John the
Ephesus,
Baptist
right?
guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're like, just
So
calm down with this guy.
here's what I would say. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or we already discussed, don't seem to be making any clear claims to Jesus's divinity, but they all three have crucifixion scenes. and they all
I
three
mean,
have trial
what we mean
scenes.
by clear, like I don't know that I would disagree. I don't know that I would agree that like they don't make any clear claims. However, like clearly John has the most clear claims, like the
Although
most like
interesting, I
explicit
would
claims.
say there some of the most Unitarian friendly passages are also in John. It's weird that way. That but anyway, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke seemingly do not, right? Or at least nothing too obvious or too quote worthy. And they have crucifixion scenes and trial scenes. And in those trial scenes, right, you get the impression that there's multiple people. Some of them are making false accusations. Some of them are making contrary accusations. They're like, oh, he did this on the Sabbath. Oh, he said he would destroy the temple. Oh, like they're trying to find anything that they can get to stick. And then they finally get to stick that he claimed to be the Messiah, right? Like, I do
Right.
think that actually was in and itself, depending on context, something that they would crucify someone for, right? Like I
I
don't
think
have
that's
them
something.
memorized well enough, but I bet if we were
Yeah.
to read through the crucifixion trial scenes, that the reasons that they peg him for weren't blasphemy in the sense that he was claiming to be God incarnate in any of the Gospels, even
Well,
John.
but I guess it would be my pushback, and like again, we don't have to go back and forth because I'd like to
Mm-hmm.
for us to both like think about this, and maybe we can come back. But here's my thing: them pushing as being like he's claiming to be the Messiah to the Romans is different than their motivation,
Right, right, right,
than their motivation.
right.
And so, like, if they can convince the Romans that, like, actually the Messiah is a political figure,
Mm-hmm.
and
And
he's
he's
going to come,
seditious, right? Yeah, that's all they need to tell the
and
Romans. He's seditious,
yes,
right?
exactly. And
But
then the Romans like, okay, fine, whatever, it's fine, just kill
I
this guy,
agree with you
whatever.
that the Jews have a different motivation, and I think that
Right,
he was just too much of a theological popular threat to too many people, seemingly for different reasons simultaneously. That they, right, like Jesus would cast out a demon, and then like the Pharisees would be like, well, why did you do that? And he's like, well, because I'm the Son of Man and I can do that. And then they would whisper themselves, and then that was when they started plotting on how they could kill Jesus.
right,
But it was seemingly a
yeah,
hard thing for them to pull off, right? They needed the things to happen at the right time in the right place, and the crowds to not be protecting him to be able to pull off. And seemingly Judas had
right.
to betray Jesus. I'm not sure exactly what Judas betrayed or
I,
exactly what that meant.
that's actually I always been like a very like strange like thing for me too. Like wait,
Right.
did they not who this guy was? Like I don't understand. But yeah, no, I
But
completely agree about that.
yeah.
That's like a fascinating separate topic. But I think
Okay.
like we're in agreement that like the 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 motivations for the Romans crucifying Jesus is different than the Jews crucifying Jesus.
Yes.
And
Yes.
my main point is that the Romans crucifying Jesus because they thought that he like could have maybe been a political figure, or even if he wasn't, like if we just kill him, it'll like make these people calm down. That's
And
fine.
it'll send a
I
good
don't care.
message.
Yeah, you're like whatever. Like at least then like okay, just like stop causing problems, whatever. Why the Jews would kill the guy claiming to be the Messiah is a completely different question.
Right, right.
And they would not do it because they thought that this guy was going to be politically seditious because they loved that. They
Some
would
of them,
not
at least.
like,
The
I
Sadducees
mean, a
and
lot of them,
the
like,
Sanhedrin maybe didn't want an overthrow, but plenty
I
of the
mean,
Pharisees probably did.
yeah, and like I mean, the zealots and everyone else, like
Yeah.
they for sure they would have all been like, yes, please
Yes.
give us some seditious like political leader that's going to do it. So like that doesn't make sense why the Jews would have united around crucifying Jesus
Mm-hmm.
for that purpose. And so like what did like it seems like it was I mean this in the Gospels, it seemed like the disciples were fairly isolated.
Mm-hmm.
That like at some point, all of the Jews kind of united, even though that Jesus had this like, you know, procession into Jerusalem and that kind of stuff, but like there was kind of a uniting around him being crucified. So like, why?
Mm-hmm.
Why would that happen? And so like that would be my question. And so like, again, like maybe that's a good place for us to end this on, is like
Sure.
that question. Like, why would the Jews have done that? And maybe we can have another conversation about like theories that you have, or, you know, that kind of stuff. And I would love to chat with you more about it. But that's my questions. Like, well, I get what the Romans killed all kinds of people,
Mm.
and they don't really care. But the Jews, for someone claiming to be the Messiah that was uniting people around that cause, why would you be so particularly perturbed about this? And why would you like, let's drag him before the Romans and have this guy strung up on a cross for it? That's a hard question. Like
Right.
that's something that I'm like, that's where like the claims that like, actually, that for me, and like, you know, you can think about it and let's come back to it, but that's where, to me, Jesus's claims that I'm God make more sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's where the Jews would be like, you know what, you guys have him, this dude's a fucking lunatic, like just go, like, crucify this guy, he's a blasphemer, and that kind of stuff, like, makes more sense to me. Because that's like, in G.K. Chesterton said, like, in some sense, like, capital punishment for heresy is the most reasonable punishment. And so, like, if someone came to me and said, like, they're God,
Mm-hmm.
and you need to listen to me, you're like, actually, like, who is more deserving of death than that? If it wasn't true. But if it is true, it's a very different thing.
Sure.
And so that's where, like, I would come back to, like, I don't understand why, like, the Jews didn't unite around suppressing any Messiah, at least that I know of, until this one.
Mm-hmm.
Why this one?
Right. So
Why this one guy?
I'll think about it more and we can get back to it, because honestly I don't have all the kind of relevant passages fresh off the top of my head. One thing that I might say is that, like, Jordan Peterson inspired a lot of resistance and anger for kind of weird and hard to understand reasons, right? Like there
Mhm.
was just this tension in the air that he seemingly set on fire, right? And
Right.
like over pronouns, right? You know, it's like, or like talking about
Sure.
Jungian interpretations of the book of Genesis, like, and there were screeds in the New York Times against him and stuff. Like, what? You know, like it like 100 years from now, this will be hard to explain in a way that makes sense. But for
I completely agree.
but for those of us who were there, we felt it, right? And we knew, like, oh man,
Right.
he just said that, and like these 10 people are going to be completely driven crazy by the fact that he said that, and you know, all these things, right? And so, like, you know, a contentious climate, and then someone who's charismatic and saying the wrong things and or the right things, you know, sets off a firestorm. And you know,
Yeah.
to our
No.
knowledge, Jordan Peterson hasn't been crucified yet. But like, I
To
think
our
there was
knowledge.
something like that sort of situation on steroids that's a little bit hard to communicate across 2,000 years. That Jesus was just the sort of person and doing the exact sort of things that caused extreme admiration and devotion from some people, and extreme animosity and hatred to the point of, you know, wanting him dead in some people. And I don't think it was because he claimed to be God. I think that Matthew, Mark, and Luke would be far more explicit about that if that were the reason. I think it would just be like, there would be a whole chapter that explained like, okay, so Jesus called himself God, and here's all of the reasons why they thought that that was bad, and here's why they killed him, and here's the witnesses coming in. He called himself God. Like, there isn't any of that, right?
I mean,
It
there's
would be a
not. There's.
strange thing to be absent. I will agree that in John 10, it does seem like the Jews get mad at him for what I would say misunderstanding him and thinking that he was claiming to be God. And I think Jesus specifically corrects them in John 10. So I won't specifically deny everything of what you're saying. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, why would they leave that out, right? Like, why wouldn't that just be plastered on like the whole from, throughout the whole book if that was what happened?
I mean, yeah, no, I mean, it's a hard question, because I do think that in some ways we're asking, like, why wouldn't you have written the book that I would have written if you were trying to communicate the thing?
For the record, I'm fine with the way they wrote the books.
Well, no, I know, but if you're saying that, like, why wouldn't you have written the book that I would have written if you were trying to communicate this thing? I think that like, it's a hard question. Like, it in some sense, I don't agree that, like, I think I don't agree that there's not like parts that clearly indicate that Jesus was God. At the same time, I agree with you that it's not explicit in the way that, like, a modern Western, like, American would want it to be, that, like, this is clearly what's happening, and that kind of thing. So, like, I agree with that. I do think there's places that's clearly pointing that way, that probably would have been understood that way, and that's probably why they didn't write it as explicit as we would, because it's kind of like, I don't know, like, it's kind of like
you think they were taking the edge off maybe to make it more palatable or something like that?
No, I don't think they were taking the edge off. I think that it was just like, it was just so obvious to them what this particular phrase or this particular story was, like, pointing to, that it was not something that they felt like needed to be made explicit. And so it's kind of like, if you come home and you give you give a glass of wine, like, say you were writing a story and you, like, pour a glass of wine for your wife and you give it to her, and she looks at you and says, "I just have a headache." Right? Like, in our modern context, we would probably know, okay, you were trying to have sex and she's just not in the mood. However, fast forward 2,000 years, is that necessarily how they would interpret that? Or rewind 2,000 years, is that necessarily how they would interpret that? Probably not. Or at least, like, possibly not. And so, in that same way, I would be cautious about saying that because it wasn't explicit in these Gospels, that it wasn't present in those Gospels. And so that's where I would, like, we would have to tease it out. Like, where is it, like, like, we have good reason to think that this is a claim of divinity, versus when this is, like, kind of ambiguously maybe a claim of divinity, but we don't really know.
And also, divinity can mean a lot of things, right?
So that's a completely another thing that I would love to talk to you about, is
sure.
Like, just the divine essence and that kind of stuff.
Because even I would say that Jesus is divine if you let me define divine. I don't think it.
Right. And so, like, that. Okay. Sam and Tripp Part 3 will be us
defining divine. Yes.
Divine. What is that? So, like, yes, but But
Yeah.
that's where I would kind of come down and like reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke is like there's a lot of references that you could take ambiguously, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they took them ambiguously.
Sure.
And so that's where like, and not that I'm 100% interpreting them correctly and that kind of stuff, but like that's where like it becomes fuzzy. That I don't think it's I don't believe that it's true that they're not claiming divinity. I just think that it's not as clear as what John is claiming. And John is writing, as you said, to a very different audience,
right,
in a very different context that makes it more clear what it is that he's trying to do, or he's making at least more like definitive statements about God or Jesus that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're just trying to like, here's what happened, you know, and it's more like kind of, yeah, that's why they call them the synoptic gospels.
yeah,
Like they're just like, here's what happened, I don't know what to tell you, kind of thing. Whereas John is more like he has a purpose for his gospel that's different than what those other ones were.
Right, I agree. So it seems like things that we should talk about next time. We didn't even entirely finish on divine simplicity and
No, we didn't.
Trinitarian logic.
We need to like narrow our conversations
Yes,
down and be like, we're
yes.
just going to talk about this.
I feel like this conversation will serve as like the broad introduction, and then future conversation will be like, okay, this topic that we had 10 or 15 minutes on, let's open that one up and then open this one up and open this one up,
Yes,
etc.
yeah, totally. Yeah. We'll allocate 15 minutes for the next topic and we'll spend 2 hours on it.
Yes. All right. Sounds good. All right. Well, I should probably go to bed, but
No, I know it's later for you than me. Good
yeah.
night.
All right. It was wonderful talking with you.
Yeah.
Let's see here. I'm going to stop the recording. I'll talk to you for a little bit.